The damp chill of St. Jude's seeped through the knees of Liam's work trousers, a familiar cold that clung to the ancient stones of the church. For 3 weeks, he'd been prying up the worn flagstones of the main aisle, leveling the subsiding ground beneath and resetting them with fresh mortar. It was solitary work, the silence broken only by the scrape of his trowel and the distant caw of crows in the overgrown churchyard. The parish of Baile Nudji Sinach was too small and too poor for a major renovation, so it was just him, a 24-year-old stonemason trying to make a name for himself, entrusted with preserving a building that felt older than the town itself. He'd finally reached the sanctuary, the raised area around the altar. Here, the stones were larger, more ornate, etched with faint Celtic knots that had been smoothed by centuries of shuffling priests. Father Thomas, the parish priest, had been specific about this section. "Be gentle with them, son," he'd said, his voice a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across pavement. "They've held a lot of prayers." Liam had found the priest an odd man. He'd been at St. Jude's for just over a decade, arriving after the old priest, Father Michael, had passed. Where Michael had been booming and present in the community, Thomas was a specter. He was a tall, stooped man with eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He performed his Sunday Mass with a detached reverence, his sermons brief and impersonal. He rarely ventured into the village, and the rectory door was always closed. The only time he seemed to display any flicker of something was during the funerals, specifically the little ones. Over the years, there had been whispers. Funerals for infants, held at dawn or dusk, with no family present. Just Father Thomas, a tiny, plain wooden box, and the empty pews. Locals assumed they were for nameless children from the city, or perhaps stillborns from the county hospital whose parents couldn't face a burial. It was a sad, strange service he offered, and most people chose not to think too much about it. One of the large flagstones directly before the marble altar rocked slightly under Liam's weight. A loose one. He slid the flat edge of his crowbar into the seam and gently prized it upwards. It was heavy, and he grunted with the effort, his muscles straining in the cold air. It came free with a grating sound of stone on stone. He expected to see dark, compacted earth like everywhere else. Instead, he saw blackness. A void, his breath hitched. He knelt, his heart starting a low, nervous drum against his ribs. The space wasn't a natural sinkhole. The edges were too clean, like a small, stone-lined crypt. A musty, sweetish odor, the smell of old decay and dry earth, wafted up, catching in the back of his throat. He fumbled for his phone, switching on the torch and aiming the bright, sterile beam into the darkness. At first, it was just a jumble of shapes. Lumps wrapped in what looked like decaying linen or burlap, tied with twine. They were small. Dozens of them, stacked carefully, almost reverently. He thought of animals. Maybe a forgotten pet cemetery from a bygone era, but the shape was wrong. Too specific. He leaned closer, the phone's light trembling in his hand. One of the bundles near the top had partially come apart. The cloth had rotted away, revealing the object within. It was pale, delicate, a ribcage no bigger than his hand. And above it, the fragile, unmistakable curve of a tiny skull. Liam scrambled back, knocking over a bucket of mortar with a wet slap that echoed unnervingly in the vast silence of the church. He couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too cold. He stared at the dark opening in the floor, his mind refusing to process what his eyes had just seen. Not one, dozens, tiny skeletons, wrapped and laid to rest in a hidden tomb beneath the altar of God. The strange, solitary funerals, the tiny, unmarked coffins. It wasn't a service for unknown children from the city. It was a ritual, and the final resting place was right here. His gaze shot to the solid oak door of the sacristy, behind which was the passage to the rectory where Father Thomas spent his silent days. A wave of nausea rolled through him. The priest's reclusiveness suddenly seemed less like eccentricity and more like something sinister. The quiet sadness of his funerals felt like a performance. For 12 years, he had been standing on this very spot, celebrating Mass, offering communion, preaching about life and resurrection, all while standing on a hidden grave of babies. Panic gave way to a cold, clear sense of horror. This was beyond odd whispers and village gossip. This was a crime scene. He wiped his dusty, trembling hands on his jeans and backed away from the altar, his eyes never leaving the black square in the floor. He needed to call someone, not his boss, not his mother. He needed the Gardaí. He pulled out his phone again, his thumb hovering over the screen. He knew the local sergeant, Aoife O'Malley. She was a no-nonsense woman from Dublin who had transferred here 5 years ago, trading city crime for rural disputes over livestock and land boundaries. She would never have expected a call like this. He stumbled out of the main doors into the weak afternoon light, gasping the fresh, cold air as if he'd been holding his breath for an eternity. He dialed her number. When she answered, her voice calm and professional, Liam could barely form the words. "Aoife, it's Liam Roch. I'm at St. Jude's. You need to come here, now." "What is it, Liam? Is everything all right?" "No, nothing is all right," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I was working on the floor under the altar. There's something here, something awful." He looked back at the dark maw of the church entrance. "It's bones," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. "God, Aoife, it's full of babies." The tires of Sergeant Aoife O'Malley's patrol car crunched on the wet gravel path leading to St. Jude's. A persistent, fine Irish drizzle, the kind that seeps into your bones, misted the windscreen and softened the hard edges of the ancient stone church. Liam was standing by the heavy oak doors, his silhouette a miserable slump against the gray stone. His face, usually ruddy from outdoor work, was the color of whey. He was hugging himself, his work jacket zipped up to his chin despite the mildness of the air. "Liam," Aoife said, her voice calm and measured as she stepped out of the car. The air smelled of damp earth and rain on old stone. "Talk to me. What have you got?" Liam just shook his head, his eyes wide and fixed on the church entrance. "You have to see it for yourself, Sergeant. I can't rightly describe it. It's not right." Aoife gave his shoulder a firm squeeze. "All right, son, show me." She followed him inside. The church was colder than the air outside, a deep, cellar-like chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The scent of frankincense and beeswax was faint, overpowered by the smell of disturbed earth and something else, something acrid and ancient. Liam's tools lay scattered near the altar, a silent testament to the moment his work had been so brutally interrupted. He pointed with a trembling hand towards the altar steps. Aoife approached cautiously. One of the large, worn flagstones had been pried up and leaned against the side of the marble altar. Below it was a black, gaping maw. She took out her heavy-duty torch, its powerful beam cutting through the gloom. The light fell into the cavity, illuminating what lay within. Her breath caught in her throat. Even with Liam's call, the reality was a physical blow. The space was filled with small, tightly wrapped bundles. They weren't just tossed in, they were arranged, placed with a strange, solemn orderliness. The linen wrappings were stained and decayed, and in places had fallen away to reveal the delicate, bird-like structures of infant skeletons. Dozens of them. It wasn't a dumping ground, it was a tomb. A secret, meticulously kept cemetery. She swallowed hard, her professionalism a thin shield against the wave of horror. "Don't touch anything else, Liam. Go wait in my car. Get the heat on." He nodded mutely and practically fled the building. Alone in the echoing silence, Aoife took a deep, steadying breath and keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Sierra Alpha 15. I'm at St. Jude's in Baile na G Sinach. I am confirming a discovery of human remains. Multiple victims, suspected infants. I need the county forensic team mobilized immediately. And notify the superintendent. This is a major scene." The dispatcher's voice, tinny and distant, crackled back with a stunned, "Copy that, Sierra Alpha 15. Forensics en route." As she ended the call, a shadow fell across the entrance. Aoife turned, her hand instinctively moving towards her sidearm before she caught herself. It was Father Thomas, emerging from the adjacent rectory, drawn by the sight of the Garda car. He was a tall, stooped man, his cassock seeming to hang off his skeletal frame. His face was a web of deep lines, and his eyes, set deep in their sockets, held a profound, unnerving placidity. He walked slowly down the aisle, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor. He didn't look at Aoife, but at the disturbed altar. His gaze drifted into the open crypt, and his expression didn't change. There was no shock, no surprise, only a deep, weary resignation. "I knew this day would come eventually," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to be absorbed by the stone walls. The stones can only keep their secrets for so long. Aoife's training kicked in, her voice hardening. "Father Thomas, I need you to step away from the altar. Can you explain what we are looking at here?" He finally turned his gaze to her. His eyes weren't those of a monster, not in the way she'd expected. They were filled with a strange, sorrowful piety. "They are the unbaptized," he said simply. "The Seleni, the little angels cast out by doctrine, denied consecrated ground. Stillborns, foundlings, babies born of shame and sorrow. Their mothers left them for me. They knew I would give them a home." Aoife was speechless for a second. The term Sillen was an old, ugly word from a darker time in Ireland, a separate, unconsecrated burial ground for infants deemed unworthy of a Christian burial. But that was history, a shameful memory. It wasn't something that happened now. You buried them? Here," she managed, her mind reeling. "I did more than that," Father Thomas said, a flicker of something like pride in his quiet voice. "I baptized them, each and every one. I gave them their names back in the eyes of God. I gave them last rites and a place to rest in his house, where they belonged. Who else was there to care for them? The world had already forgotten them." His confession was so calm, so matter-of-fact, it was more chilling than any frantic denial. He saw no crime, only a sacred duty he had taken upon himself. As he spoke, the first of the backup units began to arrive, their blue lights flashing silently against the stained glass windows, painting the saints in strobes of red and blue. The forensic van, large and white, pulled up behind them. White-suited figures began to emerge, carrying cases of equipment. Across the lane, behind a lace curtain in a small cottage, an elderly woman named Ethan Doyle lowered her binoculars. She had seen the Garda car, then the priest, and now the white van she knew meant something terrible. She picked up her telephone, her hand shaking as she dialed her daughter in the next village. "You won't believe what's happening at the church," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and morbid excitement. "Something awful, something to do with the father." The first stone of rumor had been cast, and its ripples were already spreading through the heart of Baile, Nudgee Seanock. The dawn broke over Baile, Nudgee Seanock not with light, but with a smothering gray mist that clung to the slate roofs and seeped into the very bones of the town. It was a fitting shroud. Inside St. Jude's, the air was cold and sterile, smelling of antiseptic and dust. The warm, familiar scent of beeswax and old incense had been scrubbed away by the harsh reality of the scene. Sergeant Aoife O'Malley stood near the chancel steps, a paper cup of lukewarm tea doing little to warm her hands. Her gaze was fixed on the pit beneath the altar, now illuminated by the stark, unforgiving glare of portable floodlights. The forensic team moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. Dressed in white Tyvek suits, they looked like specters from another world, meticulously partitioning the grave with strings and plastic markers. Each tiny bundle, wrapped in rotting linen or wool, was documented, photographed, and assigned a number before being gently lifted and placed into a sterile evidence container. Leading the exhumation was Dr. Ardal Kenna, a forensic anthropologist from Dublin whose calm demeanor was a small, steadying rock in Aoife's churning sea of disbelief. He walked over to her, pulling down his face mask. His eyes were tired but sharp. "Sergeant O'Malley." "Doctor," Aoife acknowledged, her voice a low rasp. Any idea of the numbers yet?" Kenna sighed, a sound heavy with professional weariness. "It's slow work. We have to be careful not to disturb the stratification. But based on the density and the area, a preliminary estimate." He paused, looking back at the hole as if to double-check the grim calculation in his head. "We're looking at over 40, Sergeant. likely more. Spanning, I'd guess, the last decade or so, consistent with what the stonemason said. 40. The word didn't compute. It was an abstract number, a statistic. But Aoife saw it as 40 mothers, 40 stories of despair, 40 tiny lives that began and ended in silence. The tea in her cup suddenly tasted like bile. She set it down on a pew. "And Father Thomas, he's still at the presbytery?" Kenna asked, his voice soft. "Under guard a watch. He hasn't said a word since yesterday," Aoife replied, rubbing her temples. "Just sits in his study, reading." The unnatural calm of the priest was more unnerving than any frantic denial would have been. It was a silent challenge, a declaration that his actions were beyond their understanding, beyond their judgment. While science was carefully cataloging the secrets of St. Jude's, rumor was tearing through the rest of the town. At Healy's Centra, the morning delivery of bread sat untouched as hushed conversations filled the aisles. At the post office, people spoke in clipped, shocked tones. The story had mutated overnight from a wild whisper into a monstrous fact. The initial disbelief had curdled into a thick brew of horror, anger, and a profound, collective shame. In O'Dwyer's pub, which had opened early to serve coffee to the gathering press, the atmosphere was funereal. Liam, the stonemason, sat at the bar, staring into a pint he hadn't touched. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. Every time the pub door opened, he flinched, as if expecting a fresh wave of condemnation. He had only done his job, only reported what he'd found, but he felt like he had been the one to pull the pin on a grenade in the heart of his own town. "It's the silence I can't stand," Moira, the pub's owner, said as she polished a glass with unnecessary vigor. "The quiet of him. 12 years, Liam. 12 years he was up there, giving sermons on forgiveness while doing that." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the church on the hill. Who were they? Where did they come from? Were they local girls, our girls? The question hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Everyone was looking at their neighbors, their friends, their own family histories, wondering what secrets they held. The arrival of a satellite van from Arte News, the national broadcaster, solidified their nightmare. The camera crew began setting up near the Garda tape, their long lenses pointing at the church like accusatory fingers. Baile na Gisinoc was no longer a small town grappling with a local tragedy. It was a national headline, a place of macabre fascination. For Aoife, the media presence was a new, unwelcome pressure. She needed answers, not sound bites. Leaving a uniformed Garda to handle the press, she made a decision. She needed more than Father Thomas's cryptic confession. She needed evidence, a paper trail. Armed with a newly signed search warrant, she walked the short distance from the churchyard to the stone-gray presbytery. The Garda at the door nodded as she approached. "He's been quiet, Sergeant. Hasn't moved from his chair." Aoife pushed open the heavy oak door. The house was immaculate, filled with the scent of lemon polish and old paper. She found Father Thomas exactly as described, sitting in a worn leather armchair in his study, a book of theology open on his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression not of surprise or fear, but of mild curiosity, as if she were a parishioner who had arrived early for a meeting. "Sergeant O'Malley," he said, his voice even. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I have a warrant to search the premises, Father," Aoife stated, holding up the document. She kept her voice steady, professional, betraying none of the revulsion she felt. He simply nodded, placing a bookmark in his book and setting it aside. "Of course, you must do your duty. May I get you some tea?" The offer was so profoundly normal, so jarringly out of place, that it almost knocked Aoife off balance. "No, thank you, Father. I'd like you to remain here while we conduct our search." "As you wish," he said, folding his hands in his lap. He watched her with those same unnervingly placid blue eyes, offering no resistance as Aoife and another Garda began the methodical task of searching his life's container. The study was obsessively organized. Books on theology, history, and philosophy lined the walls. Correspondence was filed alphabetically. There was nothing out of place, nothing to suggest a hidden, dark life. They searched for an hour, finding nothing but parish financial records and sermon notes. Aoife was beginning to feel a spike of frustration when she opened the bottom drawer of his large mahogany desk. Inside, it wasn't the register of births or baptisms she had hoped for. Instead, there was a stack of small, hardbound ledgers, the kind used for daily accounting. There were 12 of them. She picked up the one on top, its cover simply marked with the year. Hesitantly, she opened it. The pages were filled with Father Thomas's neat, precise script. Each entry was just a date, followed by a single letter, a G for girl or a B for boy, and a short, cryptic phrase. March 12th, be found by the river stone. A cold night's child. May 28th, G left in the offering box, so very small. September 2nd, be a mother's desperate prayer answered. Aoife's blood ran cold. It was a logbook, a meticulous, chilling record of his secret ministry. It was not a confession of murder, but a diary of what he considered to be acts of salvation. This was his paper trail, his justification. As she flipped through the pages, seeing year after year of these stark, heartbreaking entries, she understood she wasn't just investigating a crime. She was excavating a history of hidden sorrow that ran deeper and darker than even the grave beneath the altar. The Garda station in Baile na G Sinach, usually a place of quiet routine broken by the occasional lost sheep or pub dispute, had transformed into an incident room. The air was thick with the smell of brewing coffee and the low hum of a photocopier. On the large conference table, Sergeant Aoife O'Malley had laid out copies of the 12 ledgers, their pages a sea of Father Thomas's spidery, precise handwriting. Each entry was a ghost, a fragment of a life that began and ended in shadow. F behind the fish market, day after the festival, blue wool. M by the old wishing well, rain-soaked blanket, August storm. F chapel steps, dawn, wrapped in a man's coat. They were maddeningly vague, yet filled with a chilling intimacy. Aoife felt a knot tighten in her stomach. These weren't case files, they were epitaphs. She looked at Garda Bayan, a young officer whose fresh face was now etched with a permanent frown of concentration. Bayan, she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the quiet. I want a timeline. Go back 12 years. Every town festival, every major storm recorded by Met Iran, every significant local event. Cross-reference it with the dates in these books. It's a long shot, but it's a start. Bayan nodded, grateful for the concrete task. Right away, Sergeant. For herself, Aoife knew data wasn't enough. She needed memory. She needed the town's living history, the keepers of its whispers and forgotten sorrows. Her first stop was the Gilded Harp. The pub was unnaturally subdued. The usual boisterous laughter was replaced by hushed, intense conversations. The discovery at St. Jude's had fractured the town's soul. Aoife saw Moira behind the bar, polishing a glass with a grim, mechanical rhythm. Sergeant, Moira greeted her, her eyes tired. The usual, just a chat, Moira, if you have a minute. Aoife slid a piece of paper across the polished wood. On it, she'd transcribed one of the entries, omitting the gender initial. Found behind the fish market the day after the festival, wrapped in blue wool. Moira stared at it, her brow furrowed. She chewed on her lip, her gaze distant. The festival, there's one every year. Blue wool so many lasses knit. She paused, then her eyes sharpened. Wait, the festival maybe 6-7 years ago. The one where the Wolf Tones canceled last minute. There was a girl worked at O'Connell's fish shop for the summer. Annie? No, Ashling. A slip of a thing from County Clare. She left right after the festival. Said her mother was ill. No one heard from her again. It was thin, a thread of smoke in the wind, but it was more than Aoife had a minute ago. Did you ever hear any talk, any rumors about her? Moira's expression hardened. In a town this size, there are always rumors about a pretty girl who leaves suddenly. But no, nothing you could take to the bank. As Aoife was about to leave, she heard a raised voice from a corner booth. It was Sean, a farmer known for his temper. He's a monster, a ghoul hiding them under God's own house. From a stool at the bar, an old woman, Mrs. Doyle, spoke softly without turning around. And where else should they have gone, Sean? A ditch, the bog. At least the father gave them a prayer. At least he saw them as souls. The argument encapsulated the town's schism, righteous fury versus a strange, sorrowful gratitude. It was a wound with no clean edge. Aoife's next visit was to Eilis, a retired midwife who lived in a small, neat cottage on the edge of town. Eilis had delivered half of Baile na G Sinach, her hands the first to welcome them into the world. She poured tea as Aoife explained her purpose, her gaze full of a profound, weary sadness. "I can't give you names, Sergeant. You know that," Eilis said, her voice gentle. "But I can tell you about the fear. Oh, the terrible, consuming fear of those girls. Some were so young. They'd come to me sometimes, not for help with the birth, but for help after. They were trapped. By family, by shame, by men who promised them the world and then vanished. There was no support, no safe place. They were utterly alone." Aoife felt a surge of anger, not at Eilis, but at the circumstances she described. "Did any of them talk about what they would do?" Eilis shook her head slowly. "They couldn't see that far ahead. They could only see the next hour, the next day. Surviving, hiding, but I remember the desperation. I always will." Armed with the ghost of a name and a deeper understanding of the silent panic that had haunted these women, Aoife returned to the station. Father Thomas was in the interview room, sitting just as placidly as he had before, his hands resting on the table. The calm was more unsettling than any outburst. Aoife sat opposite him, sliding a copy of the ledger across the table, open to the entry from the festival. The day after the festival, 7 years ago, a girl named Aisling worked at the fish market. She disappeared right after. "Was it her baby you found, Father? Wrapped in blue wool?" For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed the priest's face. It wasn't guilt or fear, but a deep, ancient sorrow. His eyes seemed to look through Aoife, back in time. He didn't answer the question directly. "The girl's secret is not mine to tell," he said, his voice raspy. "It was a secret born of desperation. I offered the only thing I could, a sacrament, a quiet place to rest and silence. I would not betray that. This isn't about betrayal, it's about murder, neglect. You hid evidence of a crime over 40 times. Aoife's voice was sharp with frustration. "I hid evidence of suffering," he corrected her softly. "I did not want their last memory on earth to be one of abandonment. I gave them a home here in the heart of the parish." The interview was a stone wall. He would admit to the act of burial, of the secret baptisms, but he would not be the one to break the seal of what he saw as his final, sacred duty to the mothers. Exhausted and defeated, Aoife walked back into the main office. The lights felt too bright, the air stale. Garda Bayan looked up from his computer, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "Sergeant, I've got something." He turned his monitor towards her. "I cross-referenced the ledger dates with the weather archives. Look, 12 of the entries have notes like rain-soaked, storm, or flood. Every single one of them falls on a day Met Eiran issued a severe weather warning for this area. A perfect match. It was a small victory, a single, solid fact in a sea of speculation and sorrow." Aoife stared at the screen, then back at the copied pages of the ledger spread across the table. The book was a code, a map of tragedies, and for the first time, she felt they had found a key. Decrypting this book wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about reclaiming these children from the shadows, giving them back not just a place, but a story. The air in the incident room at the Baile na G Sinach Garda station was thick with the scent of stale coffee and drying raincoats. Sergeant Aoife O'Malley sat at her desk, the 12 ledgers of Father Thomas laid out like a tarot spread of sorrow. Each cryptic entry was a ghost, a whisper she couldn't quite hear. The weather data had given them a spine of truth, but they needed flesh, bone, a human story. The door opened, and Dr. Kenna entered, her face etched with a familiar professional weariness that Aoife had come to recognize in her own mirror. She carried a thin file folder, the sterile manila a stark contrast to the aged, personal ledgers on the desk. "Sergeant," Kenna began, her voice low, "my preliminary report." Aoife motioned for her to sit. "What have you got for me, Kenna?" "We've completed the initial examination of all 43 recovered remains," she said, opening the folder. The clinical detachment in her tone was a necessary shield. The gestational ages vary from as low as an estimated 32 weeks to full term. The primary causes of death, where discernible without full toxicology, are consistent with hypothermia and malnutrition. There are no signs of direct physical trauma, no broken bones, no skull fractures. These babies weren't killed. They were allowed to die, or died shortly after birth from lack of care. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. It confirmed the priest's story of finding them abandoned, but it did little to soften the horror. "We're processing the materials they were wrapped in," Kenna continued, flipping a page. "Mostly old cotton sheets, some towels. But the first infant we fully processed, tagged as Infant 1, corresponds to the first body Liam found directly under the altar stone." She paused, looking directly at Aoife. It was wrapped in a hand-knitted blanket, blue Aran wool, very distinctive pattern. Aoife's breath caught in her throat. She pulled the oldest ledger towards her, her fingers tracing the spidery script of the very first entry from 12 years ago. "BG boy, found by the old stone wall near the lock. Storm coming in, wrapped in blue wool. Named him Brendan." "Blue wool," Aoife repeated softly. The priest hadn't just been recording events, he had been recording truths. Small, heartbreakingly specific truths. "There's something else," Kenna said, her expression shifting slightly. "The wool has trace elements in it. Salt, certainly, from the proximity to the coast, but also a specific peat signature. It's faint, but my lab thinks it might be traceable to a particular region if we get lucky." Before Aoife could process this, Garda Bayan stuck his head in. "Sergeant, the Arte crew is here, and a van from Virgin Media. They're blocking the whole street. The superintendent is on the line. He says we need to make a statement. Control the narrative, he says." Aoife closed her eyes for a second, the pressure mounting. Control the narrative. It felt like trying to cup water in her hands. She stood up, smoothing her uniform. "All right, tell the superintendent I'll be ready in 5 minutes. Let's give them something." Standing behind a podium set up hastily on the station steps, flanked by Bayan and a grim-faced superintendent, Aoife faced a barrage of flashing cameras and outstretched microphones. The gray, drizzling sky seemed to reflect the mood of the nation, now fixated on this small, wounded town. She kept her statement concise, professional, and devoid of the raw emotion churning inside her. "The investigation into the discovery at St. Jude's Church is ongoing," she stated, her voice steady. "At present, forensic specialists have confirmed the remains of 43 infants. The timeline of these burials appears to span the last 12 to 13 years. We are treating this as a sensitive and complex investigation." She paused, letting the weight of the number sink in. "Our priority is to identify these children and, where possible, their parents. We understand the circumstances that may have led to these tragedies are deeply personal and complex. I am appealing directly to anyone, anywhere in the country, who may have information. If you entrusted your child to someone in this area, if you left your baby in what you believed was a safe place, please come forward. We have dedicated lines, and I can assure you, you will be met with compassion and discretion." In a quiet, tidy living room in Ennis, County Clare, a woman named Royson watched the broadcast, a half-finished cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She was 30 years old, a primary school teacher with a life built on order and routine. The news from Baile Naji Sinach had been a strange, distant tragedy until now. But as Sergeant O'Malley spoke, a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. 12 years. The time frame was a perfect, terrible fit. Her mind flashed back to her sister, Deirdre, then a terrified 17-year-old. Deirdre had spent a summer working in a hotel near Baile Naji Sinach and came home a different person. Hollowed out, secretive, her laughter gone. Months later, the shameful secret came out. There was a baby. Their parents, rigid with piety and fear of local gossip, had arranged for her to go away to a home until it was over. Deirdre had refused. She ran away. She was gone for a week. When she came back, she was no longer pregnant. She never spoke of what happened, only that the baby was gone to a better place. She had taken with her a blue Aran wool blanket their grandmother had knitted, a frantic project started in secret when Deirdre had first confessed to her older sister. Deirdre had never recovered. She drifted, moving from town to town, a ghost in her own life. Roisin, bound by a promise and family shame, had never asked the questions that haunted her. Where did you go? What happened to the baby? The reporter on the screen was now speaking to a local journalist. Sources say some infants were found with personal items, distinctive blankets. The teacup slipped from Roisin's fingers, shattering on the floor. The blue blanket. It couldn't be. Her hands trembled as she looked up the number for the Baile na G Sinach Garda station. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a betrayal of her sister's silence, a betrayal of her parents' desperate wish to forget. But 43 babies in a cold, secret grave. What if one of them was her nephew? A child who had a name, even if only in her heart. She had called him Oisin. Back in the station, the phones had been ringing off the hook, mostly with cranks or well-intentioned but useless calls. Aoife was rubbing her temples when Bayan approached, holding a receiver out to her, his hand over the mouthpiece. "Sarge," he whispered, his eyes wide. "I think you need to take this one. A woman, from Ennis, she's talking about her sister. And a blue wool blanket, 12 years ago." Aoife's fatigue vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. She took the phone, her knuckles white. Sergeant O'Malley speaking. The voice on the other end was a fragile thread, woven with years of unshed tears. "Hello, my name is Roisin Tierney. I was watching the news. My sister, her name is Deirdre. 12 years ago, she had a baby boy. The drive west to County Clare was a study in changing landscapes. The rolling green fields and familiar hedgerows of Baile na G Sinach gradually gave way to the stark, limestone wilderness of the Burren, a gray, lunar expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. The air itself felt different, sharper, laced with the salt of the Atlantic that bit at the windows of the Garda car. Sergeant Aoife O'Malley drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Garda Bayan sat in the passenger seat, silently reviewing the sparse notes from Roisin Tierney's phone call. The ledger entry was simple: BG 8/11/2011, blue wool. A storm from the west. A baby girl buried 11 years ago during a storm, wrapped in blue wool. Roisin's directions led them off the main road and down a narrow lane that wound towards the coast. Her house was a modest, modern bungalow perched on a low cliff, its windows staring out at the churning, gray sea. As they pulled up, a woman with nervous eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves stepped out. Roisin Tierney. She led them into a small, immaculately tidy living room. A fire was lit in the hearth, more for comfort than for warmth. She offered them tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "Thank you for coming all this way, Sergeant," she began, her voice soft. "Thank you for calling, Roisin," Aoife replied, her tone gentle. She knew this was not an interrogation, but a difficult exhumation of memory. "You said on the phone you recognized the details from the news report. The blue blanket." Roisin nodded, twisting a tissue in her hands. "It was our grandmother's. She knitted one for every grandchild. Mine was pink. Deirdre's was blue. When she had her baby, it was the only thing she had to wrap him in." "Him," Bayan interjected softly, glancing at Aoife. The ledger read BG, baby girl. Roisin's brow furrowed in confusion. "No, it was a boy. A little boy, she named him Cillian." Aoife felt a jolt, a mistake in the ledger, or something else. She made a note but didn't press the point. "Please, Roisin, tell us what happened. Tell us about Deirdre." And so, the story tumbled out, a torrent of grief and guilt held back for 12 long years. Deirdre, her younger sister, had been only 17. Their parents were devout, traditional people, pillars of their small Clare parish. The father of the baby was a seasonal worker who had disappeared the moment he learned she was pregnant. For Deirdre, telling her parents was an impossibility. The shame, she believed, would have destroyed them. "She hid it for almost 8 months, Roisin whispered, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Baggy clothes, staying in her room, I knew, of course. I was the only one who did. I tried to get her to talk to Mom and Dad to see a doctor, but she was paralyzed with fear. Not just of them, but of the whole town. You know how it can be. The whispers, they're louder than shouting. Aoife knew. In a place like Baile na G Sinach or a parish in Clare, reputation was currency, and shame was a debt that could follow a family for generations. The baby came early, Roisin continued, her voice cracking. There was a storm that night, a terrible one blowing in from the sea. Our parents were away, visiting an aunt in Galway. It was just me and her in the house. She went into labor in her bedroom. It was awful, Sergeant. There was so much blood. The baby, little Cillian, he was so small. He lived for maybe an hour. He never cried. He just slipped away. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant roar of the waves. Aoife could picture it. Two terrified girls, one in the throes of a secret, tragic birth, the other trying desperately to help, with a storm raging outside as if the world itself was in agony. We didn't know what to do, Roisin sobbed, the tissue now shredded in her hands. We couldn't call a doctor. We couldn't take him to a hospital. There would be questions. It would all come out. Deirdre was frantic. She kept saying he couldn't just be disposed of, that he needed to be blessed, to be buried in holy ground. She was so religious, you see, more than any of us. The thought of her baby being in limbo was torturing her. So what did you do? Aoife asked, her voice barely a whisper. The next day, I drove her. She had heard a story somewhere, a rumor about a priest in County Meath, in a small town, who helped girls in trouble. A kind man who wouldn't ask questions. She wrapped Cillian in her blue blanket, placed him in a shoebox, and I drove her there. I dropped her off at the edge of the town, Baile na G Sinach. She told me to come back in 2 days. It was the worst 2 days of my life. When she returned, Deirdre was waiting by the side of the road, gaunt and empty-handed. She looked like a ghost. She never spoke of what happened in the church, not in any detail. She only said that the priest had been kind, that he had prayed over Cillian and promised him a resting place with God. Then she made Roisin swear never to speak of it again. She was never the same after that, Roisin concluded, wiping her eyes. A part of her died with her son. She lives quietly now just up the coast. She works from home, rarely sees anyone. This news I haven't told her. I don't know how. When I saw you on the television and you mentioned the blue blanket, I knew. It was him. It was Cillian. But why did the priest write girl? Aoife looked at her notes, the pieces clicking into place with a dreadful finality. The shame, the secrecy, the desperation to give a child a holy burial, and a small, devastating detail. Roisin, she said carefully, your sister's name is Deirdre. What is her full name? Deirdre Grain Tierney. Grain. Aoife felt the air leave her lungs. Father Thomas hadn't misidentified the baby's gender. He hadn't recorded the baby's name at all. He had recorded the mother's. BG Baby of Grain. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a shield. The priest hadn't just logged the dead. He had logged the living, the grieving mothers who came to him in secret, using their names as the sole identifier for the children they couldn't claim. Every initial in that ledger was a mother's name, a silent testament. Leaving Roisin's house, Aoife felt the investigation shift on its axis. This was no longer just about identifying infants in a mass grave. It was about finding the mothers, dozens of them. Women like Deirdre, living in the shadow of a secret that had defined their lives. She now had a name, a location, and a complete, heartbreaking story for one of the shrouds. Her next step was clear, and it would be the hardest yet. She had to go and find Deirdre Grain Tierney. The drive back to the Tierney cottage felt different. The initial tension of a police inquiry had dissolved, leaving a heavy, somber air in its place. Roisin met Aoife at the door, her face etched with a protective worry. She's agreed to speak with you, she whispered. Please, Sergeant, be gentle. Deirdre was sitting in an armchair by the unlit fireplace, a worn woolen throw pulled tightly around her shoulders despite the mildness of the day. She looked smaller than Aoife had imagined, fragile as old parchment. Her eyes, the same deep blue as her sister's, were hollowed out by a grief that had lived in the dark for 12 years. Aoife sat opposite her, placing her notebook on the small table between them but not opening it. This wasn't an interrogation, it was a bearing of witness. "Deirdre," she began, her voice soft. "Thank you for speaking with me. I just need to understand what happened." For a long moment, Deirdre just stared at her hands, twisting a loose thread on the throw. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the story tumbled out, fragmented and raw. She spoke of the panic, the crushing shame that felt more powerful than grief itself. She described the silent, terrifying birth in her own bedroom, her parents asleep down the hall, Royson her only confidant. "He was so still," she choked out, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "My little boy, Cillian, he never took a breath. And all I could think was, what will they say? What will they do to me?" She talked of the drive, the darkness outside the car, a mirror of the despair inside her. She remembered Father Thomas's face in the dim light of the sacristy, not judgmental, not horrified, but weary and kind. "He didn't ask questions," she murmured, her gaze distant. "He just looked at Cillian, wrapped in his little blue blanket, and he nodded. He said, 'I'll take care of him. He will have God's blessing and a place to rest.' He gave me the only thing anyone could, a bit of peace." As she spoke, Aoife saw the entire case shift on its axis. The crime was not the burial. The crime was the silence, the fear, the society that had left a terrified 17-year-old girl with no other choice but to seek a secret grave for her son. The initials in the ledger, BG, Baby of Grain, weren't a cold cataloging. They were a promise of anonymity, a shield. "He saved me," Deirdre said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Not my soul. He saved me from disappearing under the weight of it all. Is he in trouble for that?" The question hung in the quiet room. "The investigation is ongoing," Aoife answered honestly. "But your story, it changes things, Deirdre. It gives a voice to what was silent." The news of the Tierney sisters' testimony rippled through the official channels. It provided the context the Director of Public Prosecutions needed. There was no complainant. The victims were mothers who had been given a desperate, compassionate service. Prosecuting Father Thomas for illegal burial, while technically possible, would serve no public interest. It would only drag women like Deirdre through a fresh hell of public exposure and shame. The official decision came down a week later. No charges would be brought against Father Thomas. The church would handle his future internally, but the law would leave him be. Aoife found him not in the presbytery, but in the churchyard of St. Jude's, standing before the excavated earth beneath the altar, now covered by a simple wooden barrier. The site was quiet, the forensic teams gone. "It's over, Father," she said, standing beside him. He didn't turn. He just looked at the disturbed ground. "For me, perhaps, but not for them, not for the mothers." "We found one of them," Aoife said. "Deirdre Tierney. She told us about her son, Cillian." A flicker of something, recognition, relief crossed the priest's face. "The boy in the blue blanket. I remember him, a beautiful child." He finally looked at Aoife, his eyes clear. "I hope we haven't caused her more pain." "You gave her peace when no one else would," Aoife stated, the words feeling true and solid. "She told me you saved her." Thomas let out a long, slow breath, as if a burden he'd carried for years had finally been lifted. "I only did what I thought was right. In the eyes of the church and the law, I failed. But in the eyes of God, I hope I gave those little souls the dignity they were denied." He paused, his gaze returning to the earth. "What happens now?" "To them, they'll be reinterred," Aoife explained. "Here, the ground will be consecrated. The community wants to create a proper memorial." The news spread through Baile Nudgy Sinach not like a wildfire, but like the slow, gentle creep of morning light. The horror abated, replaced by a profound, collective sadness. The narrative shifted from the monstrous priest with a secret graveyard to the quiet tragedy of forgotten women and their babies. Moira, from the pub, organized a fundraiser. Eilis, the retired midwife, helped coordinate with families who came forward anonymously to donate. And Liam, the stonemason who had started it all, was commissioned to carve the memorial. He chose a simple, unadorned slab of local granite. There were no names chiseled into it. for the secrets of the mothers were still sacred. Instead, he carved a single, powerful inscription, En La Tainig Tu by Gra Ann. The day you came, you were loved. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the memorial was dedicated. The whole town was there. Father Thomas stood at the back, no longer their priest, but simply a man among them, his future to be decided by a bishop in Dublin. He had been quietly retired. Aoife watched from a distance as Deirdre and Roisin Tierney arrived. No one stared or whispered. Deirdre walked to the granite slab and placed a single white rose at its base. Her tears were not of shame this time, but of remembrance. She was one of several women who had made the journey, finding solace in the shared, now public, acknowledgement of their private grief. The case of the St. Jude's babies was officially closed. The ledgers were sealed, archived not as evidence of a crime, but as a testament to a strange and painful chapter of Irish life. For Aoife, justice had taken an unexpected form. It wasn't found in a courtroom or a prison sentence. It was found in the quiet dignity of a name spoken aloud, a rose laid on a stone, and the final, peaceful silence of a consecrated grave. The secrets of Baile na G. Sinach had not been erased, but brought into the light where they could finally be laid to rest.